In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace your front lower control arm on this Toyota Camry. Just so you know, after this procedure, you will need an alignment. Let's get started. If your vehicle has a locking lug nut, it should have one of these locking keys that goes on it. Find the correct slot, and I'm going to break this free by hand before I raise the vehicle up and use an air impact or electric on any of the other lug nuts. It is not recommended that you put an impact on that. So with a 21mm socket and a breaker bar, break this free. At this point, it is safe to put an impact on it because it's already broken free, and you basically just want to avoid the high force that the impact will put on this because it can break the little teeth internally. Now continue with your impact or tool of choice. 21mm socket, remove all the rest of your lug nuts. Remove your wheel. If it's stuck, give it a little tap. It should pop right off. Because I'm installing a control arm that is already mounted to a ball joint, I will be removing the knuckle for this video. If you are just replacing a control arm, you don't have to do that. You can separate the control arm from the ball joint, and then you can reference this procedure to unbolt the control arm from the subframe and bolt it back up with the torque specs. The axle nut should be squished in a little bit, peened over right here, just to lock it. So take a punch that fits in there, or any other tool that you might have, and give it a few taps to hopefully raise this ridge up just a little bit. Now take a 30mm 12-point socket and remove your axle nut. If you don't have a powerful impact to do this with, it's going to take quite a bit of force by hand. You're going to want to either put the wheel back on and pop the center cap off, put this on the ground and just wrench it, or use the breaker bar, or you can put a pry bar between the studs. But if you have an impact, that is going to be a whole lot easier. There we go. Next, you want to make sure the axle pushes through the hub. This one is fairly stuck on here, so I want to take a rubber mallet and try to tap it through. There we go. Looks like it started to move. That's good. I'm going to spray some rust penetrant in there. Well, more, because I already sprayed it all over. And then I'm going to work it back and forth a little bit. Now, if this is really stuck for you, what you can do is either put the axle nut back on flush and then use a steel hammer, or take a punch right in the center there and punch it through. You want to make sure this moves so that when we pull the knuckle away, it doesn't separate the inner CV joint of the axle. Next, let's remove this 12mm bolt that holds on a couple brackets. Take the brake hose off, take the ABS wire bracket off, and then pop the ABS wire off of the strut. There we go. Next, we have to remove the tie rod end here, and this cotter pin looks like it's a little rusty. I'm going to try to get it straightened out and pushed through, but if I can't, I'm going to have to cut it flush. Looks like it's not really working out in my favor here. That broke off flush. Use a 17mm socket. If you're doing it this way, you're going to have to tap the socket onto the hammer. Now tap the side of the knuckle here. That should pop the tie rod free from the knuckle. There we go. Let's remove these two 17mm bolts that hold the caliper onto the knuckle. On this one, hold the caliper so it doesn't fall down. Pull it off the rotor and hang it to the side so it doesn't put any pressure on this brake hose. My rotor's stuck on here, so you can either use a hammer, tap right between the lug studs, or put some 8x125 bolts in here, and threading those into the rotor will actually push it off of the hub. Don't hammer on the braking surface. If you're going to reuse the rotor, that will damage it. Okay, there you go. Next, I'd like to take the ABS sensor out and there's a 10mm bolt here that we have to pull off before the sensor can actually come off. There we go. Take this out. I'm going to spray some rust penetrant in here so that I can soak it down. Now I'm going to grab some pliers. With my pliers, I'm going to grab it right on the end here, spin it, and pull it straight out. Now let's remove the strut bolts that hold the strut onto the knuckle, 22mm wrench on the bolt side, and 22mm socket on the nut side. Sometimes they get seized in here, in which case you'd have to tap them out. I'm going to remove this one completely. Looks like someone's been in here before. Mine have anti-seize on them, which is a good thing. Take this one out as well. With those out, you should be able to pull the knuckle down, push the axle through. Okay, there we go. Let this sit like that. On this lower ball joint nut that we can now access, there is a cotter pin on this side. Mine looks like it's in pretty bad shape, so I have low expectations for it. I don't think it's going to come out. I'm going to try and wiggle it back and forth to break it free, but most likely I'm going to have to do exactly what I did with the tie rod, cut it flush, hammer a socket over it. Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going to happen here. Going to hammer in this end over here, make it flush with the nut. Let's do the same to this side. You're going to need a 19mm socket for this. And take it off. There's nothing holding this ball joint stud to the knuckle other than the pressure of it being pressed in there. So let's get a hammer, hold up on the knuckle and down on the control arm. Naturally, it's going to want to swing down, and this should pop free. There we go. We have to remove this engine mount off of here, or at least move it up and out of the way, so that we can remove the most forward bolt on this front control arm. To get this mount out, I'm going to start up here, remove this nut, and then we can separate it. This is going to be a 19mm nut. I'm just going to put a wrench on it and see if I can break it free. There we go. Okay, well, looks like for me, the whole stud is coming out of the mount, which is okay. It actually might be better. Now sometimes the stud stays in the mount and the nut comes off the stud, in which case you will have to just fight it a little bit extra when pulling it out, because you'll have all of this extra space here. But I guess this worked out for me. There we go. Looks like someone's been in here before. This is covered in anti-seize, and that is most likely why this happened. Underneath, we have 3 mounting nuts that hold on this mount. One over here, out in the open, you can see it. The other 2 are behind these plastic caps that we have to pop off. Take whatever you have that'll fit in here and pop them off. $17mm socket. Now I have a support, a pole jack in my case, because I'm working on a lift. If you're on the ground, just use a floor jack. I'm going to put a rubber pad in here. You can use a piece of wood if that's what you have. Right on the corner of the transmission pan, I'm going to lift up to remove pressure off of this mount over here so we can get it out of here. Just raise it up about an inch, maybe an inch and a half or so. Don't go more than that because you don't want to damage any other components here. Now you can take this mount, lift it up and out. This is where it came in handy to not have this stud in here. Otherwise you'd have to probably lift up a little bit more in the transmission and then pry it out. Now I'm going to lower this down just a little bit, not all the way, but just enough to release some pressure off of the pan here. I don't want to push on it really hard for a long time. Just going to leave it like that. You still need that support because now there's no mount, but now we can access the bolts for our control arm. Now use a 22mm socket, an extension, and maybe even a swivel. Take these two bolts off. There's one. And number two. At the back of the control arm, you'll see a 19mm headed bolt and then a 19mm nut at the top that you'll have to hold with a wrench. Remove the nut, remove the bolt, turn the control arm a little bit so you can, oh, there we go. Okay, there it is. Now you can take your control arm and wiggle it till it comes out, and there is your control arm with the ball joint. On the inboard side of this front mounting bushing, you'll have this spacer sleeve looking piece. Take that so we can put it on the new one. Here's your new arm. Slide this over. Take the control arm, put it in the rearward bushing first, just like that. Take this rearward bolt. I put some anti-seize on it so I can stay nice and clean. Push it through. Once you do, get that mounting nut on. I'm just gonna get it close so that I can be temporarily secured on here. Now swing this control arm around and bring it over like that. Let's get these bolts back in. These can be tightened up now. Snug up this rear one now. This bolt gets torqued to 100 foot-pounds. The nut should have a little bit of a grippy area to it on the flange right there, so if you need to hold it, but hopefully you don't need to. I was prepared though with a wrench. It's important that you get an accurate torque on these. 148 foot-pounds is the torque for these two front bolts. All right. And two. Perfect. Those are both tightened properly. Let's raise up the engine and transmission so we can get this mount back in. Slide it in like that, drop it down. Now lower the transmission back onto the top of that. Now let's get this stud back in. Make sure it threads on nice and smooth and doesn't cross thread in there. Now I'm not worried about tightening this stud unevenly because this nut is pretty well seized on here. So as I tighten this, that stud just bottomed out, as you can see, and I'm just basically gonna snug it. And once I snug this mounting nut, it's actually going to pull on both ends of this stud because it's trying to pull the stud up. So therefore it's tightening both sides of it, and that will make it nice and even. The torque on this mounting nut and stud is 70 foot-pounds. I can't fit a torque wrench in here because of the clearance issues, and if you can, go ahead and torque it to 70 foot-pounds. But what I'm gonna do is just make it nice and tight by hand with this wrench. It's a pretty long wrench, so I have some good leverage, and that should be plenty tight right there. Let's put these mounting nuts back on. Let's snug them up. The torque for these three mounting nuts is 73 foot-pounds. All right. And if yours are still in good condition, don't forget to put back these caps that protect the threads under there. There we go. On the axle, I recommend putting some anti-seize or some type of grease on the splines at least, just so that it doesn't get seized onto the hub in the future. You don't have to go very thick on the coating, just a thin layer should do. Try to avoid getting it on the threads, just keep it on the splines. Now take your knuckle, put it on the ball joint stud. Let's get this mounting nut on. Let's snug it up now. The torque for this is going to be 91 foot-pounds. All right, that's torqued. Now the cotter pin slot needs to line up with the castle nut, which actually mine lines up perfectly. Most of the time they don't. So in that case, you have to continue tightening in order to get this to line up and not loosen. I got lucky on this one, it looks like, because it is pretty much spot on here. Having said that, I'm just going to put my cotter pin right through. There we go. I bend the other one down. However you bend it, you want to make sure that it's not in the way of the axle shaft that will be going right through here. Let's put the axle back in the knuckle. And then make sure it goes through the hub as you push this in to line it up with the strut. If it doesn't, give this a couple spins. That'll make the splines line up just like that. Push this in, and I have a bolt ready. Just like that. That's going to temporarily secure it in place. Put in the second bolt on the bottom and the two mounting nuts. Grab your 22mm socket and let's tighten these up. I'm actually going to start with this top one, and that is because if I start with the top one, I can easily do this and push the knuckle in just a little bit. These bolts are not adjustable, but they do have a little bit of wiggle room to them, and I recommend that you start with them pushed in. You can let your alignment professional do the rest of the alignment adjustments after you're done with the job. So I'm holding that one with a wrench and snugging this one up, and once you do that, you can let go. The knuckle will stay exactly where you tightened it. Let's do this bottom one. The torque for these bolts is 214 foot-pounds. Grab your torque wrench and hold the bolt side if needed. I recommend torquing the nut side because that usually gives you a more accurate torque since you are overcoming the friction of the entire bolt. The torque wrench says it's torqued, but I did see the bolt spin a little bit, so I'm going to try this again while holding this. There we go. I want to make sure that it's actually tight. Let's do the same to the bottom one. There we go, that's tight. All right, now let's put on the axle nut. I'm gonna bottom it out with a power tool, and then the torque for this is 217 foot-pounds. There we go. Not too worried about over tightening it with this tool since it's such a high torque. Now I'm going to grab my socket and torque it, but in order to stop this from spinning, I'm actually going to put a pry bar through the lug studs. You can prop it on the ground. In my case, I'm going to try and prop it on the lift arm, but in order to torque this, you're going to need this to stop spinning. This is my setup here. Make sure that if you're using a pry bar like this, you have it put flat between the lug studs so that it doesn't actually destroy the threads. That's it right there. Now, if you remember when we took this axle nut off, we had to unstake it. Well, now we have to restake it, which is what's going to lock it in. The axle has this cutout here so that you can punch in the end of the axle nut, and that will prevent it from backing off by itself in case that happens. So take a punch or a chisel bit and a hammer and just punch it down a little bit. You don't have to completely smash it, but you just want to peen it over. That should be good right there. Now I'm going to coat this hub in some anti-seize, and I'm going to do that so that it doesn't rust in the future. Just a thin layer all around will do the job. I'm also going to focus right around the center of the hub here. That's where the rotor will also seize, a main contact point, and then a thin layer across the face of the hub. If you put too much, it will actually start flinging off as you drive, especially at highway speeds, and you want to avoid that. So you just want a coating enough to prevent rust, but not enough to actually get all over the rotor. once you start driving. Try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. That will actually provide you with a false torque on the lug nuts, so that is not a good thing. These are already coated, they will not rust. Do not put any grease on them. I cleaned up the backside of my rotor since I'm reusing my old rotor. It had a little bit of rust built up, and I did not want to put that back like that because right here where the hub sits, if it's not perfectly flat, it's going to cause braking issues. So with that sanded down, I'm not worried about coating it because the anti-seize off of the hub will actually get on the rotor too. I'm going to slide this over, make sure that seats nicely just like that. Perfect. Now take your caliper, slide it over the rotor. Those pads, if they don't fit, put them at an angle like this, and then just push it on. I have my bolts ready to go here. Once the bolt holes line up on the caliper, start them in by hand. .79 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these bolts. And 2. Let's get these brackets back on here for the ABS and the brake hose. They kind of sandwich together like that. There was a 12mm headed bolt holding these onto the strut. I recommend greasing this bolt up or putting anti-seize on the threads because a lot of times these do rust. Make sure that's snug. Put this retainer back in the knuckle. This was for the ABS sensor. You want to make sure that wire is properly secured. To reinstall the ABS sensor, I recommend putting some grease right on the base of it right there. I already did. This will hopefully prevent it from getting stuck in the knuckle in the future. Line it up with the hole, get the bolt, and start it in. When you tighten this bolt down, just give it about 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out. You don't need to go any more than that because if you do, it's over tightened, it can break easily. That's it right there, just snug. You can also crack the housing or the ear, retaining ear off of this ABS sensor if you over tighten it. You want to try to avoid that. As long as it's properly seated all around, nice and flush, you're good to go. Now take your tie rod, put it in through the knuckle. Make sure that stud goes all the way down. Move the knuckle if needed. Let's get that castle nut back on. If your cotter pin broke like mine did at the beginning, or you had to cut it, make sure you drill that out. Hopefully that is not the case for you though. Start this on by hand, snug it up. The torque for this is 36 foot-pounds. The trick here is that when you finish torquing it, you want that cotter pin slot to line up with the slot on the castle nut. If it does not, continue tightening, not loosening, to get it to line up. So technically I am torqued there, but I will check the slot and it does not line up. I have to keep going a little bit. A little bit more. All right, that's perfectly lined up for me right there. So I'm gonna get the cotter pin through, just like that, and leave a little bit of wiggle room in the cotter pin. If you make it nice and tight up against that castle nut, it is more likely to seize in place. If it can move around a little bit, it will not. So now take some pliers or whatever you have, and you want to make sure you bend this cotter pin all the way up so that it is out of the way of anything that it may come in contact with, and you also want it to be locked in. There we go, just like that. That's tight. Let's get the wheel back on. Put on all 5 of your lug nuts, bottom them out, and then we'll torque them in a cross pattern to 76 foot-pounds. Once again, 76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. There you have it. Don't forget to get an alignment.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.